Hey everyone, welcome back. Dave in History for the Ages here. So, the national debt, right? This is a very important topic. In one of my other videos, I talk about how any government, it's an old saying, any government big enough to give you everything is big enough to take it away. And the idea of how many people have become dependent on government and why this is dangerous. Another one of my videos I have, but I've never done one explaining the history of the national debt and why it matters. And I'm really curious what you all think about this. I want your comments on this. Who do you blame for the national debt? Do you think we've crossed the Rubicon, the point of no return, right? So like, share, leave comments. I really think this is a topic that not enough people are aware of in terms of the dangers of it. So I'm going to kind of give a little bit of history, but also connect it with where we are today, right? It's all connected. So this is a crazy graph, right? And this shows our national debt over time. Now, real quick, what's the deficit? What's the debt, right? So the deficit is kind of your yearly shortfall. So if you're supposed to spend $1 trillion, but we spend 1.5 trillion, that's your deficit, the difference between the trillion and 1.5 trillion. The debt is adding all that up together over years, plus the interest that we owe on it, right? And you can see, if you look at this graph over time, for a long time, our national debt was not that massive. It was always kind of pretty stable, pretty small. And then you see around the late 1980s, 90s, boom, it takes off. And I think this graphic really illustrates why this is a serious problem. Over the last really 20, 25, 30 years, it's getting a lot worse. So I think this is a good place to start. And I'm going to show you a close up of this as we get to more current events. How did it all start? So we started, U.S. Revolution. We had to go to a debt, but it was, tiny, right? $75 million. Of course, that was a lot more back then. But even back then, there was discussion. Hamilton. You see the picture of Hamilton here. He thought, a national debt, if it's not excessive, would be fine, right? Not everyone even agreed with even a small national debt at the time, right? There were people like Jefferson and Madison. There's a paraphrase by Jefferson. He said, we must not burden the future generation with the debts of the present. And of course, I'd be really curious, what do you think these guys would be thinking today if they saw where we are today with the national debt? Even someone like Hamilton, it was like, yeah, all right. Even those folks would have been like, hey, what's going on? But first, it was pretty small, right? I'm going to explain to you how this eventually became such a big problem. Then we had some increases over time. Obviously, when you deal with big crises like the War of 1812 and the Civil War, we had a bigger debt spike taking place. But we eventually even eliminated the debt under Andrew Jackson. We were able to basically get the debt to almost nothing there. And then the big change, and this is a really important figure. I don't talk about a lot of economists, and to be fair, I'm not an economist, but I know a few things. And if there are any economists, I'd love you guys to talk about this. Especially at the end of this video, I want to kind of talk about have we passed the point of no return or not. And I'd really love people who teach economics or know about economics to kind of chime in on that. But this guy named John Maynard Keynes, right? So we go through the Great Depression, and Keynes comes up with what becomes known as Keynesian economics. And the idea behind Keynesian economics is that when you're in a budget crisis, when you're in a recession, when things aren't going well, it's okay to boost spending. The idea behind it is you spend extra money that stimulates the economy, gets you out of the recession, and then as the economy increases, you have more revenue coming in and you can pay down the debt. The problem is, once we started to use Keynesian economics, and especially more recently in the last 20 years, we've kind of, just my own phrase, I think we've put Keynesian economics on steroids. And doing that has become very problematic in terms of where we could go into the future. So that's Keynes, very important person in the whole idea of deficit spending. So then we get to World War II, and our debt rises. And at one point, we had this very important idea here, where the debt to GDP ratio was higher than 100%. What does that mean? So the gross domestic product. In other words, what the country owes, if it's over 100%, owes more money than what the country makes every year. And when you get to that point, you're in trouble. Now, during World War II, it was just short term. And then I'm going to show you another image here in a bit, which shows you kind of how this ratio has changed and where we are today. Because we are past that 100% mark again, and now it's getting even more serious. So here you can see the breakdown a little closer from 1980. The first graph was kind of more over a longer period of time. And you can see here, I don't know how well you can see this here, but let me put my glasses on. You can see kind of, I put some things here where you see kind of key moments where things really kind of took off. So like around, early 2000s, we had 9/11 and you had the Iraq-Afghanistan war. You had also things with Medicare coming up. Then, of course, you have Obama and you have Obamacare. That happened. You had the financial crisis. And when we had the financial crisis in about 2008, that put a lot of stimulus in. Then, of course, we move on and we had obviously eventually get to COVID and the stimulus packages and all of that, where we were spending just tons of money, quote unquote, stimulating the economy. And this is where you see this debt just rising dramatically from, 5 trillion to where, when I'm recording this, we're over $36 trillion. You can see, in the early years, 1980s, it started a little bit between 1985, 1990. We were pretty flat. And then around the late 1990s, it starts to go up, but it's really been more in the last about 20 years. And I put all the administrations up here because I think one of the points is this is not a Republican Democrat thing. I do think it is fair to point out that generally people who are part of the more left-wing perspective believe in bigger government spending, and people who are on the right believe in less. But folks, when Elon Musk decides to come in and say, hey, we need to make some cuts, and everybody loses their minds over some small, what I would call smaller cuts, he didn't even get into the really serious things, which I'll explain here in our last slide in a second. And I saw how people react to that. That's what kind of stimulated me to make this video. I'm like, wow, people are upset about the cuts that Musk is proposing. There are much more serious things that need to be dealt with. And so there's something called the national debt clock. If you've never seen it, I took a screenshot right before I recorded this video, and you could see where our national debt is today. And I really want you to look at that debt to GDP ratio again. 1960, 1980, 2000, and where we are today. We're now over 120%. So again, that means our debt is bigger than what we're producing every year. Now, does this mean we have now crossed the Rubicon, right? I love that phrase, the point of no return. Are we already done? Not necessarily, but we're getting pretty darn close to it. Right now, investors, people who own the debt, right, basically, still trust the American government to repay it. And about 75% of that debt is owed to domestic people, 25% owed to foreign. But at the same time, the interest costs alone are about 1 trillion, right? And that's faster than what we spend on defense. And entitlements are growing, and eventually where this can lead to is kind of this debt spiral where you have to borrow money just to pay the interest, right? And when you start to borrow money just to pay the interest, you're really into this debt spiral and you're in huge trouble. Governments might end up just printing money like crazy, but then that costs inflation. Or we might have massive taxes and massive cuts. Now, when I say massive cuts, I'm not just talking to some silly little program where we're putting aid into, PBS or, some foreign nation and we're giving them money for some program for a nation. I'm talking about big things. I'm talking about Social Security, Medicare, defense, because at the end of the day, that's where the real money is. Should we be cutting all the little things that are away? Sure. But people need to understand these big programs are what takes up a lot of the money. And if we don't begin to deal with this in a clever way now, eventually this is going to just end, I think, the ability of the United States to function well. And that's a kind of scary thought. So again, I'm not an economist, and I would hope people who know economics understand this, but it doesn't take a fancy degree in economics to know you can't keep spending more every year than what you take in at the rate we've been doing and not get to this point. And if you get a chance to look at the national debt clock, I'll kind of leave the link here in the description so you can see it. Look at the unfunded liabilities. That's pretty crazy, right? And you see the unfunded liabilities. In other words, things we're supposed to fund in the future, but we have not managed to do enough of. So I wanted to kind of share a little history, express why this is kind of an important topic. I'd love to hear your comments on it. I have another video on the graduated income tax. I have a history on that, so you can watch that as well. But I do want to kind of hear what you think about all this. All right, everyone. Thank you for watching. Important topic. I hope you kind of share with others. All right, everyone. Have a great day.